We can go ahead. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in this room. Across the world, I hear there are several participants participating online in various parts of the world. And it gives me great pleasure to moderate this session this morning. Let me just introduce myself. I'm Martin Chungong. I'm the Secretary General of the Interparliamentary Union, the global organization of parliaments, and I come to this discussion as the parliamentary representative on the steering committee of the GPEDC. And this morning, it gives me great pleasure to be moderating a session during which we would be looking at the role of parliaments in ensuring effective development cooperation. And we have a very exciting panel indeed. But I should say, in order to frame this discussion, that, of course, development cooperation and parliamentary role a matter of concern for both the global south and the global north. And so the discussions this morning should address the lessons learned by both sides of the pond, so to speak, the developed donor community and the global south that is the recipient of development assistance. So when we look at the current context, we see that in many countries, governments are facing budgetary constraints. The economic growth is stalling as a result, among other factors, of the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. We also see cases where countries are threatened with debt default. And so when you look at all these challenges, you then begin to agree that accountability is important when it comes to effective development cooperation. And we want to narrow this to the role that parliaments are playing. As you know, accountability is one of the four cardinal principles of effective development cooperation, and we want to argue that parliaments have a strong role to play. But I want to mention that this is a two-way street. Parliaments can contribute and participate in accountability by holding government accountable in the context of the budgeted processes, making sure that development cooperation is inclusive, participatory, and transparent, and holding government generally to account. But on the other hand, parliaments too need to be accountable to the people and communities that they represent. And I'm hoping that during the discussions this morning, we will be looking at both sides of accountability. And then, when we talk about accountability on parliamentary oversight, what are we really talking about? We are looking forward to your insights into this, but I would like to say that we want to look at the budget process. We want to see, parliaments want to see whether all aid is on budget, is accounted for in the context of the budget. We want to see whether all assistance is being allocated according to the priorities identified in national development plans. And of course, parliaments need to be able to be assessing the outcomes, the results of development assistance through, I see somebody from the audit community here, and also other independent evaluations. And of course, we want to see how parliaments are scrutinizing external loans, how they are oversighting concessions for the extraction of national resources, and how they are involved in developing public-private partnership contracts for society. All of this is just to frame the discussions we're going to have today. And with me, I have four eminent specialists, each in their own area, and we're going to hear from them their various perspectives. I hope. It looks like I've been cut off. We lost. Okay, I think I'm back. I'm back. So I said we have four experts with us this morning, and we hope that they can address some of the key questions that we have identified. How can parliamentary oversight of the budget and key aid processes be strengthened? How can donor support for parliamentary oversight be scaled up and made more effective? A question for the Global North in particular. How can parliaments contribute to national dialogues for development cooperation? So these are some of the questions that I would like to invite the speakers this morning to address. We have four of them. I must apologize because I am the global chair of International Gender Champions, which means that when I sit on a panel like this one, I want to make sure that there's gender equality. We have equal numbers of men and women, but today we're slightly imbalanced. Yes, but for a good cause. I see for once that women are in the majority on this panel, and it's something that we need to rejoice over. So we have with us Honorable Unity Dow, an outstanding member of parliament from Botswana, who will speak to us from her own direct experience as a parliamentarian, and she will be looking at the constraints that her parliament faces in participating in effective development or effective oversight of development cooperation. We have Her Excellency Mrs. Bonivian Otavo from the Lao PDR, who also will be giving us insights into her experience as a member of government working with parliaments in the context of effective development cooperation. We have to my far left there Mr. Ina Gorison, Director General of Intosai Development Initiative. Intosai is the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, a strong partner in effective development cooperation. We're going to be hearing from you, Ina, about the challenges faced by Supreme Audit institutions and other independent oversight bodies. You may want to talk also about how capacities of Supreme Audit institutions can be strengthened in the context of effective development cooperation. And last but not the least, we have Christina Lance with us. She's Senior Policy Advisor of Alliance Sud. I do understand that you are a watchdog of Swiss development cooperation in general and the involvement of Parliament in oversighting development cooperation. We do understand that your views are that the Swiss Parliament could be more active and proactive in ensuring effective development cooperation. So we would like to hear from you, and maybe you tell us why you think that the Swiss Parliament could do a better job of promoting effective development cooperation. So without further ado, I would like to call, first of all, Unity Dow to give us her initial remarks. I thought we agreed as friends that you would have 5 minutes, and if you're nice, 7 minutes. Please.
But I also asked for one.
Oh, one? Okay. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel to talk about Parliament's participation in this very important topic of effective development cooperation. Let me start my remarks with stating the obvious, but it's known to everybody, and some of the stuff that we've already touched on, that in fact it is the executive part of the government, often called the government, in fact, that is responsible for generating national budgets. I mean, they may do this, through various ways. It may be very consultative, maybe top-down approach depending on the country, but generally they are responsible for generating or putting together the budget. They're also responsible, the executive, for mobilizing resources. They can do this through loans, and a loan, of course, is a piece of legislation that must come to Parliament, because Parliament now has to, say yes, go and raise this loan with World Bank or whoever. They may do this through taxes, and of course taxes are regulated by laws in any particular country. They may do this by exports, in the case of Botswana, diamonds and coal, or selling services, in the case of Botswana, tourism. And they may also do this through ODAs, arrangements, and of course triple P arrangements. And these last two, often don't find space in Parliament. And I think that's one of the reasons we are having this discussion. But the national budget, regardless of how it's raised, is actually a piece of legislation, it's a piece of law, that then regulates how the executive, or government will then spend the funds raised for the next year, or sometimes, depending on the country, for the next 5 years, but often it's 1 year. Triple P contracts, like I say, which are beginning to be talked about in my country, there is no clear space as to how parliaments would actually play a role in negotiation of those triple P contracts. In fact, one of the biggest triple P contracts in my country, I guess, that has actually been there since independence, or since 1972 or so, is the De Beers Botswana contract. So again, that is negotiated off Parliament by the executive, but it's a very major part, of how funds are raised to actually to fund the Botswana economy. And of course, the other one is development cooperation contracts. In countries like my own, where the country is not funded primarily from taxes, you don't get the kind of language you find in the north, to say, how are you using my tax dollars? How are you using my tax euros? Because there is not clear relationship between the citizen and the money that's actually funding the economy. So often, government is seen as a benefactor as opposed to a custodian of the public purse. That's why we talk about government schools. We talk about government hospitals. We talk about the government national park as opposed to the public school or a public road or a public hospital. And I think this disconnect, the seeing assets, national assets that belong to the government, disempowers the citizen because they are grateful when a school is built. If it takes 10 years to build when it's supposed to take 5 years to build, they don't feel that they are empowered or they even have the space or the right to say, why is it taking 10 years for you to build this school? Because there isn't a sense that that money that you get from diamonds, that money you get from ODA, that money you get from loans is my money, and therefore I have a right to say how it's spent, regardless of its source. And I really think there has to be a language change about to look at government, not as a benefactor, but as a custodian of government, of the public purse. And in the case of Botswana, so of course, when you have the SONA, or the State of the National Address, you have the budget addressed by the Minister of Finance. There will always be a talk about, we are thankful to our development partners for the support they give. There's always that one line. But there isn't a clearer statement about or detail about what is this development partnership that we're talking about. In fact, I want to bet that if you were to ask parliamentarians in Botswana, there are 61 of us, maybe 28 are cabinet, so they may be able to answer the question. If you ask, what does ODA stand for? I bet 8% would never have heard the term at all, and they wouldn't know what you're talking about. And I think it's important for parliamentarians to know this and for the people to know this, because you cannot be accountable for something that you don't own or that you're not responsible or you're not in control of. And I really think at the end of the day, citizens of the world, whether they be in Botswana or in Switzerland or in Sweden or whatever, they have to know the nature and extent of these relationships, because only then can we understand why it matters, that the money or the funds should be, used in a particular way. Who are you accountable to? So that when the citizen of Switzerland is asking, where's my money going to, the citizen of Botswana should be able to say, of course it's coming here for these reasons, so that it's because it's a two-way street. I often, maybe I digress, I'll come back to that in the event that actually there's a question in that respect, okay? Let me try to keep it to my 5 minutes. But at the end of the day, I'm making a case for resourcing of parliaments all over the world, especially in the global south, especially in Botswana. That if the role of parliament is to make law, that very important law that says I'm going to slice up the national cake, on set priorities, they ought to know, where the money comes from to start with, and they also be part of the budget, process. And on the other hand, if they're going to oversee, the spending in the next year, their oversight function is compromised if they are under-resourced. I mean, for the average parliamentarian, for myself as a member of parliament, for example, I have no support at all. So you have to go and read yourself. Otherwise, but the debate about any legislation, debate about the budget legislation is more about, no, I think you should build, a school in my district. Or I think, so as opposed to really the policies, even challenging the priorities set. And governments have a way of making sure that, in my country, for example, the parliament is very executive heavy, meaning that, heavy in terms of numbers, heavy in terms of knowledge. Of course, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Education, the Minister of Transport, doesn't matter, is supported by a whole host of experts who actually influence the putting together of that budget. But the parliamentarians who are now supposed to make that budget into law has no support at all. And I really think that it's important that they be supported in that function so that there can be greater participation and also just training. Training of how to look at a budget, training about what happens in other countries, and to promote ownership, of the process, and educating the citizens. The way it is, the citizen believes that the parliamentarians, is my champion, almost like, like Jesus, as to God. So he's the one who intercedes to make sure that God does, the right thing. So they're supposed to go and talk to the cabinet ministers, say, please make that road happen. And if they don't happen, you didn't do a good job in talking for me, I may change my religion here. I'm just kidding, okay. I don't want to offend anybody. So, but at the end of the day, that's a relationship. So I really think that's important, that there be greater transparency and greater knowledge about how budgets are funded and where the money comes from, so that there can be a clearer ownership and clearer accountability. How does, and let me just one more last thing, is that people say, yeah, but parliament, laws are published at least 30 days in advance. If you're a member of parliament, you can read it, you can educate yourself. First of all, if you don't know how, many of them, you were a teacher before, then you're a member of parliament. You're a bus driver before, you're a member of parliament. You're a veterinarian before, you're a member of parliament. You're a lawyer before. It doesn't mean that you have the skills to actually, look at the budget, even understand even lawmaking before you're elected into office. So you need education in the personal level, to be able to do this. And I think I had a thought that just went away, but on that, I think I'm going to stop here. If there are any questions, I will address them. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Unity, for those insights. Just let me ask, in your parliament, what's the role of the opposition when it comes to oversight, accountability? In some countries, for instance, the Public Accounts Committee, which plays a strong role in ensuring transparency and accountability, is chaired by the opposition. Is that the case?
That's the case as well.
Is the case in Botswana?
Well, the Public Accounts Committee is chaired by the opposition.
Yes.
It's about 8-member committee, okay, and has to be, in terms of majority, of course, the ruling party, but the chair is the. Yeah. And what happened at home, actually, the last election, 2019, is, I would say, 80% of members of parliament were new.
Okay.
So, again, transfer of knowledge, transfer of experience, gets compromised by that. So that's when you really need education as well.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And the PAC, the Public Accounts Committee, it may have oversight. But what does it do? It sit down and said, oh, we told you to spend money on transport. You spend on something else. What does the Minister of Finance do? The next time they just bring your bill to Parliament again to ratify what they did. So, and the other thing, with the thought actually kind of flew out of my head was about how, although there are rules about how a law gets passed, the executive can always shortchange the system because they can bring a bill on a certificate of agency.
Oh, okay.
You know, and then of course there's very little debate, and then there's no time to debate, and then you find that, you know, yeah. So, and because it is heavy in terms of numbers, heavy in terms of knowledge.
Okay.
You know, I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm just saying that, you know, there is always a tension between the executive and parliament, which is necessary. We tend to manage that tension in a way that benefits everybody. That's why there's this discussion. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. I think you made a good point that government is not really the owner of the country's resources. They're just there as what we call caretakers, custodians, and they have to manage these resources on behalf of the people. So ultimately, accountability is to the people, and that's where parliaments come in as representatives of the people, if I do understand very well. Let me turn now to somebody who is on the other side of the aisle, a member of the executive arm of government. We will listen to the Deputy Minister from Lao PDR. And please tell us, what are the lessons you've learned working with Parliament in the context of effective development cooperation? Are there any challenges that you faced? And is there something that we can do, you would do better in the future to scale up the effectiveness of development cooperation? Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this very important opportunity to join this panel discussion. And thank you for the question. On behalf of Ministry of Planning and Investment and Lao PDR, I am very great honor to be here to join this very important, the event. This is my first time to join this, and I'm very glad to join, and meet you all here in this important session. And I am sure that this session will bring, a lot of lessons learned for further enhancing and strengthening the cooperation between, all stakeholders, especially regarding the strengthening the role of the Parliament's members and also their stakeholders on this development cooperation. And regarding your question, I like to, share with you some points. The first, in this, rapidly evolving of development cooperation, we know that, the role of Parliament is very critical and important for us to ensure that we have, the transparency, participatory and also inclusive governance to ensure the achievement of our sustainable development for all. And in Lao PDR, I'm happy to share with you sustainable development goals have been incorporated into our national development plan. So we have 5-year plan, and we implement our medium term, which is called 5 years national socio-economic development plan through the annual basis. And Ministry of Planning and Investment, where I work for, is assigned to work closely with line ministries and provinces and development partners to formulate the national plan, to monitor the implementation and reporting the result of implementation to the government, to ensure, the effective cooperation between all stakeholders, of course, the government and the parliament's members. And there's, as mentioned by our colleagues, MPI, they allocate the budget together with Ministry of Finance, and we submit to the government, and then after having endorsement, we also submit to the National Assembly for their approval. So we have National Assembly at the central level, and we do have at provincial level, we have also the provincial people committees and parties and assemblies. So we have one capital and 17 provinces in our country. Therefore, they become national assemblies and parliament's members play a key role in ensuring the implementation of the plans that has been endorsed by the National Assembly, and also to enhance, the partnership for effective development cooperation, so which was adopted in our country in 2015. We call that Vientiane Declaration on Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. And we believe that the national sustainable development strategies and planning process are the entering point for Parliament's members to involve on the policies, formulation and also its implementation. And as such, we have been putting greater efforts to systematically to engage members of parliaments from the very beginning to the end of the process. So we work closely with the members, parliament members, especially the committee on planning, budgeting, and auditing, to ensure our plan is implemented in a sustainable manner and more effective way of development. And we have been also working with partners to explore the collective information on development cooperation, because the world now is, the situation is changing very fast, rapid change. So we do need to upgrade, the database so that we could share, could learn from each other, and to monitor the implementation and to report to, the parties concerned, especially to the government as well as development partners who effectively supporting us from the beginning, on the formulation until, the implementation phase. And we have very good support from development partners. And Parliament members also, very grateful to all development partners for their continuing support, especially during our difficult times of the COVID-19 pandemics and, economic downturn. And we believe that investing in monitoring and implementation and the impact of development strategies is greatly important, and parliaments can help, place greater focus on the monitoring part and assessing the implementation of the plan, and of course also assessing the work of the government as a whole, and also to assess on the allocation of all resources. So we have, the budget from the government, ODAs, and private investment, and, the contribution from the peoples. And last but not least, financial support and technical support to the parliaments to ensure, the effective cooperation is needed. So to oversight, to the implementation, of all development strategies and plans to ensure that we achieve our goal and target and that we set in the plan. So I do hope that all development partners will continue support, Laos, as well as, parliament members and government members to pass these difficult times and achieve our goal and target. For the future, we will continue working closely with parliament members, starting from the formulation of the plan, and also, inviting them into the process of roundtable process. So we have here, Madam Sarah, UN representative. So we will work closely with roundtable process is another platform that, involve all stakeholders, development partners to discuss and solve problem together and, achieve, our goal and target, and we will not leaving no one behind. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency. You've made a strong case for interaction between the executive arm of government that you represent and Parliament. I do note that in the PDR, unlike in Botswana, you have two tiers of parliamentary representation. You have the national parliament and you have the provincial parliaments. And if maybe you want to shed light on how at the provincial level oversight is carried out by parliament, the provincial parliament and the over the government. And also it would be good to know from you also, when you go to Parliament, who are you speaking to in Parliament? Do you have a dedicated committee in Parliament that is responsible for development cooperation? Is that the committee you go to, or you go to the Finance Committee or the Planning Committee? Which are those bodies that you have in the Parliament in Laos that are dealing with development cooperation?
Thank you very much for a very good question. So regarding the involvement of the provincial parliaments, so it is very important because the local authorities are the one who implementing our strategies, I mean the government strategies. So the involvement, for example, Ministry of Planning and Investment, so is assigned by the government to formulate, to monitor, and to report on the national development plan. At provincial level, we do have Department of Planning and Investment and in own provincial authority, I mean at own level. So they are the one who working closely with the committee on planning, budgeting and auditing. And we do have, other department working, for example, education, working with educational parliaments and committees. So they are working closely, and MPI also, we regular check, how they work and how they implement. For example, we divide, the role and responsibility regarding the investment part, government investment. So over 20 billion KIP so is endorsed by the National Assembly, and lower than 20 billion KIP so endorsed by provincial authority. So we have MPI working closely with the planning, budgeting, and the auditing committee. So we working in a regular basis, And we do have their feedback on how to improve, the situation, and also how to improve the planning process. And we do receive, their frank feedback on the people comments on how we work and how we allocate the budget, how we respond to all the needs of the people. So we try to improve, our work performance, and we do have, a regular meeting, our quarterly meeting, and even for the urgent topics. So we do meet, monthly basis, and we, as I mentioned earlier, we involve also them in the future. We will involve them on the process of RTM more, I mean roundtable process, to involve with other development and partners. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Excellency, for those answers to my questions. Very, very impressive indeed, and we look forward to further conversations with you on how we can improve upon interaction between the government and Parliament. Let me now move on to somebody who represents a very important cog in the wheel of effective development cooperation. Ina Gorinson, you represent Supreme Audit Institutions, which I think in many jurisdictions are part of the official architecture of government. Although you contribute or you operate in an independent fashion. Can you tell us how you come to development cooperation, how you work with parliaments, what would be the type of relationship that you would like to have with parliaments, and also what are the challenges that you are facing as a very important partner in development cooperation.
Thank you very much, Martin, and a pleasure to be here. Parliaments and supreme audit institutions, or national audit offices as they're known, they are mutually dependent, they're complementary in terms of providing oversight vis-à-vis the executive, also when it comes to development cooperation. At the same time, these two pillars that are supposed to be independent are also facing very similar challenges when it comes to actually carry out their mandates and really realizing their potential as contributing to effective development cooperation. Using country systems is a recognized way of increasing ownership. And this principle can be reinforced if you also have proper oversight institutions that are independent, supporting Parliament. A key challenge, however, in my opinion, is that the current system of using country systems is not inclusive enough. The focus from, at least in most countries, is very much on the executive. It's the executive that receives the majority of the support. It's the executive that is at the bargaining table speaking to development partners, and not all the other institutions that is part of the ecosystem of public financial management. So let me start with the volume of support, because like as Unity said, we see a clear priority in much of the development support going to the executive and through the executive. And for supreme audit institutions as key pillars, we see that the support has actually fallen over the last years in terms of real support. And this is a paradox, because I think it increasingly is recognized that oversight, accountability, and transparency are key pillars in terms of ensuring effective development cooperation. This to ensure that the money is spent in an efficient manner, that you get most out of the dollars you invest, that the money actually reaches their final recipients, and that the support is done without money going into the pockets of the wrong people. Audits done by SEIs of the COVID-19 financing illustrates this, I think. Because during COVID-19, we saw that those countries that do not have proper oversight systems and accountability systems in place, they received billions of dollars through the IMF and other agents. And we've seen that millions have been wasted, either because of wasteful use or because the money has been stolen. And this goes also for development aid in general. So I think there is a really red flag coming out of COVID-19 that we need to strengthen these systems if we want the money to actually reach the recipients. Increased and better support to SEIs and parliaments will enable these institutions to conduct their oversight mandates more effectively and providing development partners with real information about where the money is going and what it's actually achieving. Also, and I think this touches about your point, Martin, I believe that the support that development partners provide to both parliaments and supreme audit institutions need to look at this linkage. The linkage between parliaments and the supreme audit institution is crucial. SEIs, or supreme audit institutions, are the primary tool that parliaments actually have to oversee the executive. And supreme audit institutions now are very different from 50 years ago when they looked at financial audits and compliance with laws and regulations. Now they tackle the big themes that you are facing, be it extractive industries, be it climate change, be it the SDGs, be it debt relief, etc., etc. This linkage is, however, very weak in most countries. In fact, data shows us that in most countries, the linkages between the audit and the parliament is the weakest part of the public financial management. So this is something I think development partners and parliaments and supreme audit institutions together need to tackle. We see, for instance, that in most countries, or in many countries at least, there's a huge backlog of audit reports that are never being dealt with. And parliaments are under-resourced in terms of actually dealing with these issues. So my call is very much for development partners to focus on this linkage and parliaments and supreme audit institutions. We've also noted that most of the dialogue, the political dialogue, policy dialogue, is very much with the executive and the development partners. And again, parliaments and supreme audit institutions being largely sidelined. Even some of the large financial institutions, like the IMF, has not really recognized the importance of parliaments and supreme audit institutions. In fact, during the COVID-19 emergency funding from the IMF, that's the first time they actually called on supreme audit institutions to audit where the IMF money goes. And that is good. It's a positive sign. At the same time, that dialogue was with the Ministry of Finance. And the Minister of Finance then went to the supreme audit institution and said, hey, you have to actually audit these funds. And that really impairs the independence of the Supreme Audit Institution, where the Minister of Finance is the biggest client. Last thing I would like to raise is in terms of independent oversight institutions. Because what we are seeing today, at least for Supreme Audit institutions, and I believe this goes for the courts, it goes for anti-corruption bureaus, etc., is that their independence is shrinking at an alarming pace. We see that it's much harder to provide independent oversight today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And this is probably linked to democratic backsliding in many countries, and we see this impairing the work of the Supreme Audit institutions in many ways. For instance, that you're not actually getting access to the documents you need to do the audits. You see that in some cases, the Minister of Finance deliberately cuts funding and human resources to make sure that you don't have that thorn in your side. You see political appointments of Auditor Generals who are close to the President and the Executive. And you see that Auditor Generals who do their job gets dismissed or their reports get censored. We have many examples today of this happening in practice. It's not always in developing countries. It's also in Europe, but it's also a lot in developing countries. We have one case now in Sierra Leone, for instance, where the Auditor General found corruption going all the way to the top of the government. 2 weeks before that report was to be published, she was suspended. And she's now facing a tribunal for basically doing her job, instead of the executive being on that tribunal. So I would also say that for development partners, it's not only about financial support. It's also about the moral support, the policy dialogue support. We see that in those cases where development partners come together as a coalition and act in an unfragmented way and actually push for policy change, for instance, on the independent institutions, they can make a difference. And I think that is a very crucial development that we need to try to enshrine in also both the global development agenda and at country level. So with that, I will finish. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Einar. In a way, you're saying that parliaments and Supreme Audit institutions face similar challenges because there are many cases where parliamentarians are victimized on account of doing their job as they should do it, right? And that's what you're telling us, that political considerations come into play, and this tampers with the independence of Supreme Audit institutions. And that issue of backlog of reports is a very important one, and it makes a strong case for parliaments to have the capacity to scrutinize the reports that are coming out of the Supreme Audit institutions. We'll come back to you during the discussions. Let me turn to somebody who does not represent officialdom, right, sir? Yeah?
Christina.
Christina, sorry. You don't represent any official arm of government. You are very, very independent. Can we characterize you as a representative of civil society?
Of course.
Okay, tell us what the role of civil society is.
Thank you very much. Thank you also to the distinguished speakers for all your important points. And I appreciate that as a representative of civil society, I also get to sit on this panel. I hope I can offer some complementary views to what has already been said, as I will mainly speak about my experience with Swiss Parliament. I think some of the points that I'm raising will also be relevant for parliaments in other countries of the global north. And I will mainly focus on some problematic areas that I see when it comes to the quality of debates that are actually being held in our parliaments. So even though Swiss Parliament has a very strong oversight function, the Swiss Parliament gets to engage as well in the budget process, as also in the development of the 4-year strategy of our development cooperation. But the main way our Parliament engages is when it comes to the yearly budget process. So when Parliament speaks about development cooperation, it is usually about the quantity of development cooperation and not so much about the quality. And what we see is that debates tend to play a lot along ideological lines rather than really informed insight about what development cooperation is or what development cooperation does. So there are a lot of misconceptions at play. Like what we would hear, for example, is parliamentarians saying or thinking that, SDC mainly provides budget support to governments with little or no oversight, so it contributes to corruption, which is actually not true because SDC spends only a very limited amount of its budget on on budget support, and I'm sure where it does, there is quite a bit of oversight. But so these are the kinds of misconceptions that are in the debate. Or another one would be that they think that, you know, money is just provided to NGOs to kind of for their own bureaucracies, and NGOs still do the same that they've been doing for 30 years. They go to Africa to build wells and schools, which again is not true. I'm sure there are some NGOs that maybe still do that, but our work is a lot more complex. So these are the kind of debates that are being held then to ask for budget cuts, because they're saying, well, our cooperation is not efficient, you know, it's not doing well. So I think it's quite important that Parliament is also engaged in qualitative debates about what development cooperation really does, especially the relevant commissions. And I think there are some obvious starting points, like now we have the GPDC conference. I think I would be surprised if we even have one parliamentarian who knows what the GPDC is, or who knows that there are, you know, development effectiveness principles, that there are, you know, really countries working on country ownership, on accountability, on things like this. So I think this would be an obvious starting point to engage them when there is such a big conference. Another obvious starting point would be the OECD peer reviews, which actually assess the quality of a country's development cooperation, which also, as far as I know, are not discussed in Parliament. Or, you know, SDC, when SDC has specific strategy discussions or important reviews going on, I think these things should be discussed in Parliament to allow for an informed debate. And ideally, I think also that to this debate, civil society should be invited, academia should be invited, where relevant, also the private sector, to have a good debate. I think a second point that is actually related to what I just said is that I think parliamentarians have very high and very unrealistic expectations of what development cooperation can do. So again, another thing we often hear is like, you know, we've provided so much money to country X, Y, why is there still poverty? So, I mean, obviously this is very simplistic because it ignores the national policy context, but at the same time it also ignores the international policy context. It ignores that there's still trade rules, economic rules, financial, fiscal rules that actually contribute to transferring a lot of wealth from the south to the north. And I don't know if you are aware of the UN's SDG spillover index, which is published every year, which assesses how a country's economic, financial, and trade policies and security policies actually affect other countries' ability to reach the SDGs. And Switzerland is regularly on the last place, or, you know, now I think we're forced worse when it comes to how we affect other countries' ability to reach the SDGs. So it means we have a lot of negative spillover effects. This is due to our financial secrecy. This is due to the active encouragement of profit shifting by multinational companies, which is basically taking money that could be used in the south to Switzerland. So there are a lot of other policies which are very relevant to global poverty and inequality, which I think should equally be discussed when we discuss development cooperation. So it shouldn't be discussed in isolation, but in a context. And here I think we actually all have a responsibility. I think us NGOs, SDC, we have to avoid simplistic narratives when it comes to development cooperation. We have to avoid painting a picture where there are technical solutions to poverty, because I think there are only political solutions, and these solutions extend far beyond just development cooperation. And so the third and last point I would like to make is that while I think it's important to have these qualitative debates, and I think it's very important that parliaments can hold our SDC accountable, that parliaments can suggest changes to make development cooperation more efficient, more effective, I think there are certain aspects which should just be non-negotiable. And this is, for example, the fact that development cooperation should benefit the poorest members of societies. It should have the aim of poverty reduction. It should not be used to fulfill other policy objectives, like in the area of migration policy or, you know, export promotion. There should be a commitment to anti-aid. So I think especially in today's climate where there are a lot of nationalistic tendencies, a lot of countries wanting to cut down the development budget or wanting to, divert it to rather look after refugees in our own countries, I think this is very important that we adopt a long-term perspective and that there are some values which are just non-negotiable. And again, to make sure that development cooperation has this long-term perspective and it stays focused on poverty reduction, I think it's very important to include the voices of civil society, especially also civil society in the Global South, and to have really, I want to end with a call really to have these multi-stakeholder conversations, engaging parliament, donor agencies, civil society, academia, also the private sector, and really talk about the quality and the value of development cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina. I could not agree with you more that civil society should be at the table. Clearly, listening to you, there is a lack of understanding within the Swiss Parliament of what development cooperation is. And it makes you have made a good point that at the table, we should be living up to the name of this forum, the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, which assumes that there are different partners on at the table. Thank you for those comments. You make the point that we cannot take this for granted in the global north, where you would think there is that understanding, and that maybe in the global south, that's where you need to enhance understanding. It works both ways. Thank you for that. I know that we are running behind schedule. I just have a few questions that are coming from the floor and from online that maybe the panelists here, my fellow speakers could address in their closing remarks. First of all, what systems are in place in parliaments to create public awareness of the SDGs? I think, Unity, you may want to answer that question, and you too, because you've made that point that there is that lack of public awareness. And who supports parliaments? I would imagine civil society is there to support parliaments too, to create that public awareness. How can the effective development agenda of GPEDC be institutionalized through parliaments? I know you mentioned, Madam Minister, that your whole effective development agenda is aligned with the SDGs, if I understand very well. You may want to comment on that. So I don't know, do we have time, Alessandro, for a few questions and remarks? Because I think we're supposed to end at 9 too? 2 minutes. So let me give 50 seconds or 30 seconds to each of the speakers here. Please, Unity, you go.
I guess to wrap up, the question was what systems are in place to actually educate the public about SDGs? Very little, I want to say, unfortunately, is a quick answer. I know we don't have time, so I will not say any more, but I wanted to suggest to, first of all, to agree with you, but also to say that I think the financing of civil society should be in the budget. I don't think, many countries, it shouldn't be something that the executive decides, it should be actually budgeted, because I think the civil society's voices went away when development cooperation did not fund it directly, so it should be in the national budget, I think. But.
Very good. You did not mention the media, the role of the media, yes, in promoting effective development cooperation, but Christina?
Yes, thank you very much. In Switzerland, we have 2 delegates for the SDGs, but again, I think they're underfinanced. There is no clear, good strategy, I would say, of how we want to reach the SDGs. It's discussed rarely in Parliament. I think recently one of the Commission discussed Switzerland's midterm report or something, but that was months after it was actually, they didn't really have an opportunity to influence it. And yesterday I heard our president say that we will redouble our efforts to reach the SDGs, so yeah. I'm waiting for some action.
Yeah, very good, very good. Ina?
I can just say on the SDGs that a lot of audit institutions have been auditing the government's implementation of the SDGs. And the results are not overall very encouraging. We see that the SDGs is very much, in some countries at least, a piece of paper that you have committed to, and no action is actually happening. So I think these efforts are important because they can actually spur government then to take the concrete steps and the people to hold the government accountable for it.
Thank you, Ina. And Excellency, Minister.
Thank you very much for the question. So in Laos, we have, steering committee for supervising, the SDG implementation, and we do have secretariat which involve MOFA and Ministry of Planning and Investment as a secretariat to coordinate with own line ministries and provinces and development partners. So we regular are having a meeting, to check the progress, especially SDG has already mainstreaming into the National Development Plan. So we use the National Development Plan as a tool to monitor the implementation of the SDG. We know that the attaining SDG is a bit behind, so we are putting our most efforts, to work harder. And regarding the development cooperation, we need to achieve SDG, and the media play a key role, to raise to raise awareness of the people, because SDG achievement need to be involve own people in the country and also development partners. So we would, continue working with the Parliament's members, especially, there would be one of the secretariat, VDCAP secretariat for development cooperation, and also they would, incorporate the development cooperation into their, work plan and implement. And also the capacity building is also need to be done regularly basis. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. What you're saying is business is music to my ears. I am very heartened by their commitment to working with parliaments as a partner, not as an opponent or an adversary, working together for a common good. I think I'll use the opportunity now to close this session. I think that one of the things that we have had here is that when we're talking about effective development cooperation, we are talking about a public good. We're not talking of something that is owned by the government. It's owned by all of us, the public. It is meant to be beneficial to all of us, and what is coming, development assistance has to be beneficial to everybody. It has to be inclusive, and for it to be inclusive, it has to be informed by the views and interests and requirements of the people, the beneficiaries, and the beneficiaries are the public, and it's not a favor that we're doing the public. They're entitled to well-being and development. That is something that I have taken, and I do understand that parliaments, there's a reaffirmation of the fact that parliaments are a key pillar in ensuring that that happens, to ensuring that there is ownership by the people, because parliaments represent the people. They're ensuring that the policies and actions of the governors are consistent with the real needs of the people. But for Parliament to do that, they need partners. They have supreme audit institutions, they have civil society, and I would say the media to educate the public, message out there that it is important to be working together. And we need to be correcting some of the misconceptions about development cooperation. Of course, it's the amount of funding that is going into development, right? But it's also about quality and efficiency in the use of those resources. And parliaments have the potential and must contribute to ensuring that efficiency. Of course, all these actors are constrained by lack of resources, political and other considerations that need to be addressed if we want to make development cooperation more effective. And I agree that more resources have to go to all the stakeholders, supreme audit institutions, parliament, and of course governments too. They need, in some countries, you need to build their capacity to properly manage the resources that are coming in through extra budget resources. Civil society, yes, you have to be at the table. And so we continue to believe in the GPEDC as a forum where we can bring together all the stakeholders to work together towards achieving efficiency, to achieving better quality of the resources that are located for development cooperation. Thank you all for being here with us. Thank you, eminent specialists and stakeholders here. And my appreciation goes to those who are in the room with us here, but also those who are online for having participated in this discussion. I hope that we all go home with something that we have learned from this conversation, and we'll take it from there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.